try to move along in the program so that we can get to your questions timely, but we also acknowledge that this is your lunch period. So thank you. And without further ado, if we could have our panelists introduce themselves, starting with my colleague, Nina.
Thank you, Elijah. Good afternoon. My name is Nina Harrison, she, her pronouns. I am the policy director at the Economic Progress Institute. The Economic Progress Institute, aka EPI, is an organization that produces research about how people in Rhode Island are doing. Can they meet their basic needs? We also monitor the state budget. And we also do advocacy, trying to get good laws passed in Rhode Island that improve people's access to economic opportunity and improve equity and increase equity in the state. I'm also originally from Rhode Island. I grew up in Providence. And I have a lot of family here, so I care a lot about trying to make things better in Rhode Island. And then I'm also an attorney. I practiced law for about 10 years before I started doing this policy work. And as an attorney, I did help people seal and expunge their criminal records in Massachusetts, with some work, especially on sealing and expunging marijuana convictions.
Thank you, Nina. Next, can we have Rep Morales introduce themselves, please?
Thank you, Elijah. Hi, everyone. Hope you're all having a nice afternoon. My name is David Morales, he, him, and I serve as a state representative in Providence within House District 7, which is the Mount Pleasant, Valley, and Elmhurst neighborhoods. And generally, my work is centered around putting forward policies that are going to support the needs of working people, those living in poverty, and communities of color, specifically through the means of advocating for investments towards our public education system, housing that people could actually afford, and raising wages. I think over the last several years, we have made some progress on these issues, but as we have seen between the increasing cost of living and the stagnation within our education system, there's a lot more action that needs to be done. So I'm really excited to be on this panel and just have the opportunity to talk a little more about some of our efforts.
Thank you, Rep, for all the work you do and for your participation today. And finally, my colleague, Zara, please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Zara Salmon, she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-founder of Cannabis Policy Coalition. We are a 100% volunteer-ran organization that's focused on equity in the cannabis space, particularly changing the existing Rhode Island Cannabis Act to be more equitable so that folks that are trying to get cannabis businesses from areas that have been impacted by the war on drugs, they are the ones that are getting some of those licenses, but then also reinvesting the cannabis taxes back into low-income communities by way of early and public education, public housing, and also health subsidies. So that's our work. And for me, part of the passion is not being from Rhode Island. Rhode Island was one of the first places that gave me community. So doing this work on a volunteer basis is my way of trying to give back to the community that gave me community.
Thank you, Zara, and you are a valued member of this community. So thank you so much for the work that you do and your commitment to serving our community. I'm going to begin with our first topics of discussion, which are around policy and pardon reform, centering around the work that Rep. David Morales is leading. Rep, why is the creation of the Rhode Island Pardon Commission necessary? And what gaps does it fill in the current pardon processes? And if possible, if you could provide a brief summary or context for individuals who are not familiar with the commission, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Elijah. So over the last 2 years, I've had the pleasure of being able to collaborate with the MUSE Foundation, in addition to other community members, especially those with lived experiences through the criminal legal system, to start the process on actually having policies in place to promote pardons in the state of Rhode Island. Now, for context, all across the country, governors have the ability to be able to pardon people within their criminal records and be able to restore all the rights and or barriers they may face because of their legal records. Unlike other states, however, Rhode Island is one of the least active, if not the least active, amongst using the abilities and powers of pardons. The last time a pardon was issued in the state of Rhode Island was back in 2011 And that was for someone who had already been dead for over 100 years. And so it was more of a symbolic pardon by Governor Chafee. Fast forward over a decade plus, there hasn't been any sense of urgency to actually address this issue and be able to restore rights and ensure that folks who have served their time and aren't eligible for an expungement still have the means to be able to clear their record. And this is why we've looked towards being able to establish a pardon commission that would be responsible specifically to establish a policy as to how one can actually apply for a pardon. Because right now, if you were to simply just Google Rhode Island pardon, you may find a very outdated and vague state website that just says, if you're interested in a pardon, you could just email the governor or send a letter to 82 Smith Street. But aside from that, there is no other form of direction. If one is to send an email or send a letter, there is no timeline in place on whether or not you will ever hear back. Meanwhile, our neighbors in Connecticut issue over 300 pardons a year. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they have a commission. They have a commission of folks that represent different community organizations and quote unquote stakeholders to be able to review applications of community members who are applying for a pardon, their reason as to why they're applying for a pardon, the benefits that they would receive if pardoned. Following the application review process, the commission then sends a recommendation to the governor outlining community members that they think should be able to move forward and receive a pardon from the governor. So what this legislation is all about, which is this year's version is titled House Bill 5379, it is designed specifically to establish this commission, spell out the duties and responsibilities, and most importantly, create structure for people who are seeking a pardon.
Thank you. Thank you, Rep. And it sounds like the creation of this commission now is obviously going to be centered around fairness and equity, of course, and we really value that. Can you share a little bit how House Bill 5379 ensures transparency and consistency in this process and clearly avoiding political influence and possible confusion?
Absolutely. So the Pardon Commission would be a public body, similar to the Public Utilities Commission, where meetings are made open to the public. Folks have an opportunity to be able to watch as commission members have discussions around the applications they've received. So there's that layer of transparency that would exist. And I, again, just want to emphasize that a lot of this is modeled off of the efforts that have happened in Connecticut, because it has clearly worked, considering that they are issuing over 300 pardons a year. But it also requires a level of political will, because it's important to note that the commission only has the power to make the recommendations to the governor. Ultimately, it still falls on the governor's desk, whoever that is, to make that decision to actually put forward the name and say, we're going to do the necessary policy steps to ensure that this person gets a pardon. But what makes this commission also important in the context of who's appointed and a part of it, we have the bill structured in a way that there would be 9 members that would be appointed as follows. There would be an appointee from the judicial branch that would be appointed by the Justice of the Rhode Island Supreme Court. An appointee from the AG's office would be appointed from someone from the AG's office, an appointee from the Office of the Public Defender, an appointee from the Rhode Island Office of Parole and Probation. So those are the bureaucratic appointments. So the 4 that I just listed off, between the PD's office, the AG's office, the Supreme Court representation. And that is designed for the purposes of just making sure that those stakeholders who, in one way, shape, or form, believe that they should have a role in this legal system process are included. But the voices I'm most excited about are the following 5, which incorporate more of a reflection of community representation, whether they're community orgs that have actively worked with folks who have the lived experience of going through the justice system, or those who are advocating actively for some of these policy reform changes. So the other 5 members would be a member that would be appointed by the Nonviolence Institute, a member who would be appointed by the Reentry Campus Program, a member who would be appointed from the Center for Indigenous Peoples' Rights, a member from the Economic Progress Institute, and an appointee from Open Doors. So as noted, all these different organizations in one way, shape, or form work with folks who either have the lived experience of having gone through the criminal legal system or are actively advocating for changes and recognize the importance of being able to have an actual legal system process that provides people with the opportunity to move forward with their lives.
Thank you, Rep. I really appreciate those insights there and for the transparency around, the work of the commission. The last question I've got for you, and I know that many members in our community are currently struggling with employment and housing, but can you speak about specifically how this commission and the parting process for those individuals, how they'll be supported and have access to obviously, social and economic mobility opportunities because of this commission work?
Of course. So having been pardoned, one would be quote unquote forgiven for their respective criminal legal record and would now have the means to be able to access opportunities related to housing, specifically on the fronts of the background checks that one usually has to go through when they are applying for housing.
Sure.
And the pardonship would essentially work similar to the expungement piece, where it would no longer be reflected on an individual's record. Same could go when it applies for state aid for higher education purposes as well. And those two are very important to know because that is what we are talking about when we say upward mobility.
Sure.
It's the upward mobility of ensuring that regardless of one's legal record, if they have gone through the proper steps, they have served their time, and most importantly, have demonstrated they've given back to the community and moved forward with their lives, there should be no barriers in any way, shape, or form that are facilitated by government to stop them from being able to access housing, be able to access education. And I would even make the argument of accessing jobs as well. Because even though we quote unquote banned the box years ago, I think it's important to note that there's still discrimination happening when it comes to job opportunities. Even if the law already says that you cannot account for one's legal record to a certain extent when making hiring decisions. So I believe that this pardon opportunity that would exist would also support for the means of getting people access to better paying jobs.
Thank you, Rep. And again, this portion of the panel is highly important. As someone who knows and has lived, has family members, again, who have previous convictions that date from when they were teenagers all the way up to when they were older adults, and it really drastically has impacted their ability to progress. Really has drastically impacted their ability to find housing, to be employed. So thank you, Rep, and the members of the commission who do this tireless and very challenging work. And I really appreciate that. Next, I'd like to transition to our colleague Zara and discuss cannabis equity and business access. Zara, can you do the same and summarize a little bit of the work that you've done thus far, and how effective has Rhode Island's social equity licensing process been thus far, and what improvements should be made in 2025? So again, just to provide a little bit of context for the work that you've been doing and how you've seen that's been effective thus far.
Of course. So to summarize the work we've done thus far, we started as a coalition in April 2023, and we went around Rhode Island to see how folks wanted to see the existing cannabis industry change. And from there, we took those suggestions and created H7855, which was a bill that was introduced for the first time last year. And what H7855 is trying to accomplish is, one, we're removing the loopholes that are currently existing to obtain social equity licensure. So those loopholes are, well, to start, I will say that social equity, social equity is a type of licenses that should be reserved for people that have been impacted by the war on drugs. And there's only 6 of those in the state of Rhode Island permitted. And of those 6, of the qualifiers to obtain social equity licenses, there are 2 loopholes. One we call the Slave Masters Clause, which is seen in Illinois and also Connecticut, in addition to other states, where if you are a business owner and 51% of your employees essentially are low income or come from a disproportionately impacted area, they, as the owner, would be able to obtain a social equity license. So the owner of Walmart essentially could obtain a social equity license. So that's one of the loopholes. The other loophole is the Jeff Bezos clause, where if you donate a significant amount of money to a disproportionately impacted area, so you would be able to obtain a social equity license. So that's why we call it Jeff Bezos, because he wants to donate $50,000 to the south side of Providence. There you go. You get one of the 6 social equity licenses. So in our legislation, we're trying to completely eradicate those 2 clauses, because the other 3, they're fine. They would go to people who have been impacted by the war on drugs, but these 2, they're not. And especially if we have loopholes in the law where folks that have more capital could take advantage of those licenses, it's going to happen. So we want to, again, completely remove that. And the second thing we're trying to do with legislation is take a portion of the cannabis taxes that are going back to essentially the general fund, which includes law enforcement, surveillance, public health monitoring, et cetera. We want just a portion of that to go back to low-income communities by way of early public education, health subsidies, and grants. So that's what the main thing is that we're trying to do as it pertains to the bill this year. But as it pertains to social equity licensure and how things should change in 2025, the Cannabis Control Commission, which is the governing body for cannabis business in the entire state, they did release their proposed regulations to essentially be the rule book for the cannabis industry here in Rhode Island. Social equity licenses haven't been given out yet, but based off their proposed regulations, they are keeping those loopholes in because it's statute. They can't take it out unless it's taken out through legislation. But something that we're suggesting is, if it doesn't leave them susceptible to litigation, score the other 3 qualifiers higher than the 2 that Jeff Bezos or, again, slave masters could take advantage of. Score the other 3 legitimate qualifiers higher than those 2. But then also, if you do have the employer taking one of the social equity licenses, a stipulation that they could put in there is that the employer has to pay their employees at least $44.21 an hour, which is the living wage for adults with at least 2 children. So if you're going to take advantage of these social equity licenses by employing people from disproportionately impacted areas, pay them a living wage. Don't just pay them $15 an hour.
Well said, Zara. Thank you for that. And I'm curious, because there's a comment in the chat here where you spoke a little bit about the large corporate cannabis business. Is there any insight on how large corporate cannabis businesses will potentially push out local Black-owned businesses, and how can Rhode Island prevent this?
Yeah, for sure. So we only have one Black-owned cannabis business in the entire state, and they're not operational just yet. They just have the license. So essentially, it is already happening. And again, if the commission doesn't weigh the legitimate qualifiers higher than the loopholes, then large corporations are going to take advantage of the licenses. And another thing to note is, the Cannabis Control Commission, they did take our suggestion of waiving licensing fees. Last year, we were proposing that they waive licensing fees for social equity applicants. They did take our suggestion on that. However, it is important to note that our licensing fees are still the highest in New England. For a cannabis business license, it's $30,000 annually in Rhode Island. However, in Maine, it's $2,500 annually for a cannabis business license. And in Massachusetts, it's $10,000 annually. So Rhode Islanders, even Rhode Islanders who are, relatively making decent money, it's not attractive to start a cannabis business unless you have a surplus of money. So the way that cannabis is being run right now, outside stakeholders are going to take advantage of the industry. So I think unless we lower our licensing fees to something that the average Rhode Islander can afford, and we take out the loopholes that will essentially incentivize those large companies to take advantage of the social equity licenses, then we're going to see this industry working for wealthy white men, as any other industry is.
Sure. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to ask you another question here about the impact of the war on drugs here. The expungement of past cannabis convictions is obviously a priority. Are current policies working, or do we need additional reforms?
Yeah, so I want to first shout out to Rep Morales because I believe you worked on the RI Cannabis Act initially in 2022, and something you all did incredibly on that is you all allocated automatic expungement. So back in 2023, nearly 25,000 folks, they got their record automatically expunged if they had one single cannabis charge. And I believe now it's in phase 2, where if you had a cannabis charge additional to other counts, you can also get your record expunged. So Rhode Island did a relatively great job on record expungement as it is. So yeah, shout out to the representatives that made sure that we are leading the nation in a way to have equitable cannabis policies, but there is still some work to do.
Certainly. Thank you. And the last question I'll ask you here, I believe we were together at one of the previous Cannabis Control Commission meetings, the public meeting there, and I felt,
Yes.
a large community presence there. Can you share what role should community organizations and policymakers play in shaping equitable cannabis regulations? And does it possibly consider, should we consider more community-based forums to have conversations around that work?
Yes, I would say yes, consider more community-based forums. That social equity focus group the Cannabis Control Commission held was incredible. Something that I really appreciate and respect about our CCC is that they do listen to the voices of the grassroots. They do listen to progressive lawmakers. So I would say show up to Cannabis Policy Coalition meetings. We have our cannabis lobbying meeting starting in a few weeks, but then also show up to the session. Tuesdays and Thursdays between, I believe, 3:30 and 5, session is in session. So speak with your lawmakers, because something that's great about Rhode Island is we're small. So it's very, our legislators and our lawmakers, they're very accessible. If you want to see this change happen, talk to them about it. Say that one of the very first lines in the RI Cannabis bill says that this should be an equitable cannabis industry. So we need to hold them accountable to be equitable in action and not equitable in name only. So again, CPC, we're completely volunteer run, and we do it by working together, by reaching out to lawmakers, reaching out to organizations. If you I don't know, as the Michael Jackson quote says, if you want to make the world a better place, take a look in the mirror and make that change. It starts with you. It starts with showing up.
Thank you, Zara, for that call to action. And I believe all of our panelists here would reinforce that as well. The State House is the house of the people. It's the house of everybody on this call. It's the house of your neighbor. It's the house of the people who are, unfortunately, sadly, traditionally and historically marginalized. And and the really strength and power and advocacy is bringing local individuals, to their constituents and letting them know directly how these things are impacting their communities. For example, I live in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and in that conversation around with the Cannabis Control Commission, it does feel like our urban communities, dispensaries are popping up everywhere. And however, the revenue that's being made from those dispensaries are not directly benefiting or strengthening that community. The Pawtucket school system, Providence school system, hemorrhaging funds. There's so many different challenges that our communities are facing, and having a dispensary kind of exacerbates some of those when the revenue is not allocated properly. So thank you, Zara, for your insights there and for that call to action, encouraging members on this call to go to the State House. We're there, and we would be happy to work with you and to coach you, but they're elected because of you. They work on behalf of you. So just want to reinforce that power to the individuals on this call. And it's not as daunting or scary. We had several of my colleagues at United Way yesterday at the State House advocating, and they really enjoyed it. After you do it the first time, it's like riding a bike. So thank you, Zara, for your insights there. Next, I'd like to transition to my colleague Nina Harrison and the amazing work that they're doing at EPI. I'd like to take a moment to discuss legislative equity impact. And Nina, can you begin giving a short summary of the equity impact work, and how do equity impact statements enhance the legislative process, and why does EPI advocate for them?
Sure. So first, equity impact statements are tools that legislators and the public can use to evaluate a proposed bill or a proposed piece of legislation. And so they're tools similar to fiscal notes. And for those who don't know, fiscal notes are tools used by legislators to let them know how much will this proposal cost? How much will this proposal generate in income or revenue or economic activity? And so similarly, equity impact statements look at a proposal and say, how will this affect all communities in Rhode Island? How will this affect especially the most vulnerable, those who maybe have been harmed by past discriminatory laws or policies that we're still feeling the effects of, like the war on drugs, which we know disproportionately harmed Black and Latino communities. And so the idea is that if at the beginning, before you pass a law, you do some research and a bit of reflection to say, how will this particular law be enforced or imposed or implemented in a specific community, to stop and say, will this harm one community more than another? Or will this benefit one community more than another? Can we use this policy to improve and heal historic discrimination and help people advance beyond the place that they are now? And another important question, does this bill actually do what I think it's going to do? Because oftentimes people have really good intentions, great ideas, and if you don't make sure to consider all of those different factors, you can sometimes end up with legislation that had good intentions, but ends up having a harmful impact on one community in particular. So that's a little bit about what equity impact statements are. I obviously think they're really important because with all of the crazy things that are being proposed at the federal level right now, I think that if any one of them were being looked at with an eye towards equity instead of trying to tear that down, then almost none of them would say, yes, this is going to make things better for most communities, or make things safer for most communities. And so the idea is that we can prevent harmful legislation by taking this extra step. And we can also create transparency in government by making sure that these equity impact statements are available to the community and to advocates. So the community and advocates can say, oh, I have been considered as a constituent. My community and my needs have been considered. And if they haven't, and that's what the equity impact says, then advocates can show up and say, hey, this says this is going to really harm my community, and I need you to change it so that that's not the case. So it's a tool for advocates, it's a tool for the community, it's a layer of transparency in government, and it's a way to make sure that all Rhode Islanders are considered in all legislation that's passed.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Nina, for the summary, for the context, and for the why EPI is doing this. Can you provide an example of how of how equity assessments in other states have influenced policy outcomes that are likely, obviously, positive? You know, there doesn't seem to be adverse effects when equity statements or equity impact statements are included. So can you provide some context around that?
Sure. So there are several other states that have different versions of equity impact statements required. Some states do it just for certain subject areas that we know have had a bad history in terms of discrimination, like the criminal justice system. So some states just require a special equity statements for bills that are passed that have to do with criminal justice. And an example, a lot of these policies are newer over the last decade or so. Our partners, our neighbors in Connecticut have actually passed a state law saying that their governor, every time their governor puts out the state budget or the proposed state budget, that the governor has to do an equity assessment of the budget and explain why all of that money and all of those allocations make sense and how they're affecting those different communities. So they're already having that layer of transparency for the community in Connecticut. And then another example of just the power of looking at things with an eye towards equity. I think the examples are most powerful in the criminal justice setting. In those instances, there were no equity impact statements required before the bill was passed. So these equity impact statements were really done after the laws were already in place. And so it's after the laws were in place that we saw Black and Latino men in particular were 3 to 4 times more likely to be arrested or jailed for marijuana convictions. And as a result of that data, that equity impact data, we got advocates all around the country saying, we've got to decriminalize this, because what you're doing is not just giving people a criminal record, not just putting them in jail, but taking away from their families, taking money away from their families, taking them out of their community, taking resources out of their community. And as a result, Rhode Island and many other states have walked back their marijuana policies and made it either illegal or decriminalized, because they're trying to use that information to make positive policy changes. Similarly, some of you may know that there used to be a really big difference between the punishment you would get if you had crack versus cocaine. It used to be like 20 times, the penalty, or you had to have 20 times as much cocaine to receive the same penalty you would if you had just a small bit of crack. And as they began to study the equity impacts of those policies, they began to realize, wow, because of the nature of maybe who's using crack and who's using cocaine, even though they're essentially the same drug, Black people were being punished so much more harshly for doing essentially the same crime. And after that, equity impact statements and research became available. Advocates used that information, and Congress did make a change to really reduce that disparity between the amount of crack and the amount of cocaine that needs to be had in order to make those punishments closer to even. I believe they're still not even, unfortunately, but there's always more work for us to do. And those are some examples of how you can use that kind of equity impact research to really force change.
Thank you, Nina, for speaking about that at the federal level. And can you potentially provide the ways in which that equity impact statements will contribute to reducing systemic disparities in Rhode Island? And I really like the fact that you've used that word transparency as well. And so if those two play a role.
Sure. So I think the opportunities are endless. I think Rhode Island is no different from the rest of the country in that, because we're part of America that has a legacy of discriminatory policies, we bear the evidence of those discriminatory policies in terms of racial wealth gaps, racial achievement gaps, racial income gaps, and gender income and wealth gaps. So if we could get legislators in the General Assembly, and Rep. David Morales is actually the sponsor of the equity impact legislation that we're advocating for. If we could get the members of the General Assembly to think about all laws, then they would think about, when they're thinking about the funding formula for public education, they would be thinking about how can we target this funding to reduce or eliminate the racial achievement gap. And there are studies showing that there are really effective ways to do that. For example, that out-of-school learning time and the disparity in access to out-of-school learning time that white and Black children get, particularly over the summer, is responsible for a majority of the racial achievement gap. And so if when they're looking at that funding formula, they're looking at it with an eye for how can we reduce racial disparities in outcomes, they might say, let's target it a little bit more to out of school time. And that won't only benefit Black and Latino students, that would benefit all students who could all benefit from out of school learning time. So that's an example of the way looking at it through an equity impact analysis could cause the General Assembly to make policies that reduce and eliminate racial disparities and other kind of disparities for all communities, the disabled, gender, the LGBTQ plus community. If they're looking at healthcare laws that they're passing and making sure that this won't be leaving out LGBTQ plus kids or their parents or their families or our neighbors, then we can make sure that we're increasing equity for those people and reducing generational disparities for those communities.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Nina, so much. And it's always, please go
Sorry,
ahead.
can I give one more example?
Of course.
Because I've got to make this plug. Another one is the way we do taxes in this state. You know, if we want to look at who's paying money or the highest proportion of their income, oftentimes lower income people in Rhode Island are paying a higher percentage of their overall income than the wealthiest Rhode Islanders or the highest income earners in Rhode Island. And that's not really fair. So that also contributes to a wealth disparity, right? If everybody's not paying their fair share in taxes, then of course the gap between the wealthiest and the lowest income is going to increase. And so one of the other things that we're promoting is a bill that would tax the top 1% of income earners in Rhode Island, because that would generate $190 million in revenue that could be used for programs that would benefit underserved communities into proven services and programs that help people advance economically. You know, and we know that as effective as a program can be, they need money to operate. And so a bill like that would not only improve equity in Rhode Island by making the tax system more fair, it would also generate almost $200 million in revenue that could be used for out of school time to make sure that our multilingual learner students are getting the kind of education that they need that's going to set them up to be successful in school and in the workforce, so that we can make sure that people can afford childcare so that they can take courses and advance in their careers or make it to work. And so that we can fund RIPTA so that people can access and get to their jobs across the state, and that we're not having to figure out how we're going to get that money every single year. And so you need to look at equity from top to bottom, from all bills, including the budget and the tax system. And so I really hope that we can get that done this year and raise that $190 million for Rhode Island annually and fund those programs that could really help us reduce those racial and gender and other disparities.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nina. And again, thank you to the team at EPI for the tremendous work and for the collaboration that, you know, we are honored to collaborate with you in this effort. And, you know, we always know that we have a strong accomplice and ally in the State House when we see our friends from EPI. I do want to welcome Juan back before we go into the questions from our attendees.
Thanks, Elijah. I just want to say thank you to the panelists and thank you for all the participants that are here. I know I was hiding behind the camera for a minute, trying to man the tech part. Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize why we're doing this and how they actually all tie together, the bills that we're actually highlighting and focusing, and how they actually tie together for Rhode Island Black Policy Month. If you know, there's always an economic impact from every single one that we talked about. And so unapologetically going to talk about this is a Black initiative. This is a people of color initiative. And we know who's affected. And I wanted to offer this opportunity for the panelists to share what they're doing and also what MUSE is also working with each one of these folks to kind of push the needle forward. So in context, it is about economic development for marginalized communities, right? Giving them opportunities. And to elaborate a little bit more on what Nina was saying, when we're talking about revenue that's coming in, the whole point of the cannabis initiative is to be proactive, right? Let's see about allocating funds to those same coffers she mentioned from the revenue that comes in from cannabis, as well as offering opportunities for people who are penalized for engaging in cannabis now can actually be part of the business, right? If they were able to have a part and get expunged, you know what I'm saying, going through that process. So now they can participate legally, you know what I'm saying, in that very lucrative business and still pay into the community, you know, and then it goes back to also tying in what Representative Morales was talking about, the bill that we're working on with the Pardon Commission, right? This is a very arbitrary process now, could help so many people that have extensive amount of probation and been doing so much good work in the community, you know what I'm saying, past their infraction, but still have that hanging over their head. So they're serving a sentence while they're out here. At which they're doing more to contribute to society positively. So I just wanted to speak on that before we open up for Q&A. Like all these things tied together, and basically a call to action is everyone's, how do you get involved? You know, and I said, support your legislators, call your legislators, you know what I'm saying, draft bills. That's how me and David met. Representative Morales and I met by putting ideas to paper and then putting paper to action. And so that's kind of what I'm telling everyone to do, telling and not asking. Like, people need to move. I'm in the spirit of Kendrick Lamar right now. You know what I'm saying? It's like, let's keep it moving, let's keep it pushing, and take advantage of opportunities like he did to, you know what I'm saying, to spark inspiration and movement. We can't just sit still and like and love and share, right? We really have to put action behind it. So I'm going to digress and leave it up for if you want to handle this, Elijah, for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the inspirational words there. And again, I know that there were some comments here in the chat, but if anyone, again, would like to ask our panelists questions, please feel free to come off of mute, ask a question, or even consider raising a hand. And I believe it'll go in order from when your hand was raised. So if we've got questions, we welcome those, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Lisa. It's great to see
Hi,
you.
everyone, and thank you so much for this forum. This is awesome. I'm glad to be part of the discussion and to hear from our presenters or speakers. A couple of questions, and anyone can take it, specifically around what we're seeing at the federal level as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm curious as it relates to the work that we're doing here in Rhode Island and this push from EPI and others around the equity statement. Are we hearing or seeing any sort of changes at the state level, specifically if there's work that would be either funded by federal dollars, or any changes at the state level around how we're looking at equity? We know that everyone seems to be running away from diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also running away from Black. I don't know if anybody on the call have realized if you use the word Black, sometime your posts disappear. So I'm curious as to what we're hearing from a cascade from federal to state, and where do we believe this equity bill will go as it relates to that at the state level this year in this session?
I'll say a piece and I'll let Rep. Morales fill in the rest. But I would say here at EPI, it's definitely a discussion we're having about holding the line. Our annual budget and policy conference, that was the theme, holding the line for equity and justice, and we don't intend to drop that now. So I think our position is that we are going to keep emphasizing equity, that it's not illegal. So to our understanding, that we're doing our best to follow along with our national partners that we work with. We're doing our best to follow along with what's happening and to make sense of it. And we do plan on helping disseminate that information to the state to make sense of what is actually restricted versus what is rhetoric. And so I think that's a big part of it. And I think there's a big fear. So I think EPI will be on the scene to try to sort through that information and make sure that it's disseminated to the public. And at least from our perspective, we're not backing down. And I'll let Rep. Morales say what he thinks about the General Assembly.
Yeah, I'll just add to Nina's point, so far I've not seen any indication at the state level that we are shifting our priorities away from equity and inclusion. And I can only say that from like the rhetoric standpoint. I have not seen anything that has demonstrated that the state is shifting away from that. Now, it's a whole other question if you are to talk about nonprofits that receive federal funding. I know that's a much more sensitive area, and I myself am not an expert around the nonprofit landscape in Rhode Island, so that might be better suited for someone else on this call. But from a government perspective, we have not seen any shifts, which I've been very grateful for. And if we do see any shifts where the governor encourages departments to refrain from references to DEI, then I think it's our responsibility to step in and say, no, we should not be backing down from that. Now, in terms of the actual legislation that we have put forward, earlier this year, we tried incorporating equity impact statements to be adopted into the House rules. Overall, I think we had a very solid hearing because of the fact that many legislators are now becoming more familiar with equity impact statements. And that's to do with the groundwork that EPI has established the last 2 years to really have legislators understand what is an equity impact statement, what are the actual benefits of it, and how can it actually influence policy in a way that's going to be beneficial to all Rhode Islanders. So we have finally gone to that point where we have established baseline knowledge, which allows us to now advocate for passage. I would say that the first 2 years was more of an education stepping stone, whereas now we're really in that position that once we introduce the House bill that will adopt it into law, as opposed to just being a part of the House rules, we're going to have a lot more momentum, considering that legislators are walking into the hearing already having an understanding of what an equity impact statement is.
Yeah, and Rep, thank you so much for sharing that, because I know, we may have looked at the governor's budget, and I don't think an equity lens that anything was sort of used in his budget. And if you look at some of the language, but I just want to do a follow-up, if I may, and anyone can chime in specifically around, nonprofit organization like us, REBA. We are Rhode Island Black Business Association. So I was on a call that was facilitated or hosted by United Way and some attorneys last week, and we were sort of DEI, right, tagged. So from a funding perspective, and I know we want to continue to do this important work and, hold the line and all of those things that we again, obviously we can't run away from Black, right? But in reality, if your funding isn't available, if your funding is cut, if corporate sector that would be funding organization like us, are no longer funding, how do we do this work? So I'm curious as to, and Rep, I was going to call you or see you in the gym to talk to you specifically around some of the dollars that the state can push to organization that might be adversely impacted as a direct result of what the president is doing at the federal level and cascading to the lower levels. So again, certainly whoever want to take it, but I would love to have a follow-up conversation with you offline, just because I know I was chatting with the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and we're seeing a lot of impact to businesses across the state as it relates to ICE, as it relates to people not showing up in places. So it's not just around what we're talking around here, but there's economic impact as it relates to bars and restaurants and so forth. So certainly a lot more to be said about this effort from the executive orders that were signed by the president and people that are follow suit and kind of just pulling back, and maybe not necessarily pulling back. It's a green light for them to do what they really didn't want to do from the jump, right?
Thank you, friends. I just wanted to acknowledge that we are about 5 minutes away from the end there. And to Lisa's point there, I do want to have a plug-in. The United Way of Rhode Island, we have the Alliance for Nonprofit Impact, led by Nancy Wolanski and team. We have consistent conversation with the federal delegation. We have an amazing delegation here, and they want to hear how the executive orders are impacting the work that you do. And so please, get in touch with our colleague Nancy, get in touch with the Alliance for Nonprofit Impact, and continue to voice the concerns that you have from your organization to the people that you serve. I did see there were a few hands up. There were a hand up by
Yeah, I actually had my hand up, but I was
thank you, Michelle.
Yes.
sort of looking at the time. But I just wanted to say, hi, I'm Michelle Wilson with the Health Equity Institute at the Rhode Island Department of Health. And our director is holding the line. He is not backing down and encouraging all of us just to continue business as usual in the work that we're doing. That's not to say that, we do have a legal team that is following the executive orders. There have been some issues around accessing data at the federal level. Our health department is 65% federally funded, so something that we're definitely keeping our eye on. But in terms of changing how we do business, that has not happened, and that we are continuing to do the equity work that we do in the department. And until we get further guidance from either the governor's office or the Executive Office of Health and Human Services, our work continues to move forward.
I'm going to jump in real quick, Elijah. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Michelle, for advocating that and bringing that up. Because I've been facing that too with a lot of discussions, right? And Lisa, I had posted about the Black Policy Month, and then boom, my post disappeared, right? And all I did was put the month in the name. And then obviously, like I said in the beginning, it's black, and people of color. I'm focusing on doubling down. And I just wanted to make this statement I made in a few meetings last week. To all our allies, this is not a fair weather game. This is not a game where you come in and when it's good and going well for you, you're involved. And then when we run into this issue, people back down. Folks that we stand on their shoulders lost their lives. Yes, we might have some litigation, right? We might have, everyone's worried about lawsuits, and that's all I hear in the rooms when they shy away from DEI. I have mixed feelings about DEI work because I really believe in liberation, because I don't know how we can actually retrofit on a foundation that's built on a racist foundation. So it's like, how do we fit that? As we can see, they moved the cheese, and now they're pulling things back that they offered as opportunity. But I'm going to digress from that part because liberation scares a lot of folks. But until we reset this to include everybody, it's always going to be a move the cheese type of situation. So, but I want to definitely make a call to action to our allies. This is not a fair weather game. Make sure you continue to support, just like you were before all this, you know what I'm saying? And be ready to fight, because we're not even at the beginning of the fight. And folks are already scrubbing websites and backing down and not doing the work, and everyone's worried about funding. And but yeah, I just want to make sure people just keep moving it forward and hold the line like EPI says.
Thank you. And it's only fitting that, again, we end this conversation with a formal call to action where all of us, again, do play a role in this effort, and it feels like a fight. There is attack on rights, there is attack on liberties, there is attack on access, and it's organized chaos at a federal level that is seeping down. So there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of fear, and there's a lot of, really organized fear tactics being placed on so many communities, but primarily on our community. And so we just really want to, reinforce that my colleagues at the United Way, my colleagues at EPI, my colleagues who are in the House and the Senate, and my colleagues Zara, our panelists, are really committed to this work. But we definitely need you to play a role in this. And it's as simple as joining a coalition. It's as simple as calling your legislator. It's as simple as, working on a testimony that is in support of, again, how you are being impacted by this. So, as they continue to really organize this chaos in communities, we need to be responsive, and we need to be, hold that line. And I think my colleague Wayona said it absolutely the best in front of a room full of leaders, very passionately, that we need to fight back. We need to stand here, and we need to stand in solidarity and hold that line. So thank you, Wayona and our friends from EPI, for really providing that confidence, and to our colleague, on here and Muse Foundation for holding this space for us. So I'm going to share my email here as well. And for the nonprofit partners who, again, have questions, concerns, are worried, please reach out. We are doing our due diligence in sharing all this information with the congressional delegation, and we know that they are going to be hard at work for us. And we're also sharing this information with the governor, with the speaker, with the Senate president, all of our state leadership, because our sector is valuable. We're literally, I believe, almost a fifth of the workforce in Rhode Island. So nonprofits matter. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining our call today. Thank you for spending this time during your lunch and being a part of this informative and transformative conversation. We hope to see you at the State House. We hope to see you a part of these coalitions and these conversations, because the work must be done by us, and they need to hear from you directly. So thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.